The United States military just admitted something most powerful agencies never admit in public. They do not know who is going to win the quantum computing race. Not Google, not IBM, not some secret lab hidden inside a mountain. Nobody knows yet, and DARPA just said so out loud while simultaneously reopening one of the biggest quantum programs in its history to figure it out. If that sentence does not stop you for a second, it should, because this is the same agency that helped invent the internet, GPS, and stealth technology. When DARPA admits uncertainty this openly, it usually means something enormous is about to happen. Stick around, because this story goes much deeper than a simple funding announcement. To understand why this moment matters, you first need to understand what DARPA actually is. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency is not a normal government office. It exists for one purpose: to fund the kind of research that is too risky, too strange, or too far ahead of its time for private companies to gamble on alone. DARPA does not build weapons directly. It builds the foundational breakthroughs that everyone else later turns into weapons, tools, and entire industries. The internet started as a DARPA project. So did early voice recognition. So did the technology behind self-driving cars. When DARPA leans hard into a field, that field usually becomes strategically important within a decade. In 2284, DARPA quietly launched something called the Quantum Benchmarking Initiative, known inside the agency as QBI. On the surface, it sounded like a technical evaluation program, the kind of dry government initiative most people would scroll past without a second thought. But underneath that boring name was an incredibly ambitious goal. DARPA wanted to figure out, with rigorous scientific evidence, whether it is even possible to build a genuinely useful, fault-tolerant quantum computer by the year 2033. Notice the specific language there. Not a quantum computer that exists in a lab, not a quantum computer that can perform one narrow party trick better than a laptop. A utility-scale quantum computer, meaning one where the actual computational value IT produces is worth more than the enormous cost of building and running it. That distinction matters enormously because for years, quantum computing has been criticized for chasing impressive sounding milestones that never translated into anything genuinely useful for real-world problems. QBI was structured almost like a filtering funnel. Companies and research teams would submit their approach to building a utility-scale quantum computer. DARPA would then run them through a multi-stage evaluation process. Stage A required teams to describe a complete system concept and provide real evidence supporting why it could actually work. Teams that survived Stage A moved into Stage B, where they refined their research and development plans and worked to reduce technical risk. The final stage, Stage C, focused on actual verification and validation, essentially proving whether the system could be built and operated exactly as designed. This is not a friendly popularity contest. It is closer to a brutal science fair judged by some of the most rigorous engineers on the planet, except the stakes involve national security instead of a blue ribbon. And here is the part that should really grab your attention. As of late 2025, 11 separate organizations had already advanced into Stage B, meaning 11 different teams convinced DARPA their approach to quantum computing was credible enough to deserve deeper investment and scrutiny. 2 additional performers, coming out of an earlier related pilot program, had already pushed forward into Stage C, the final and most demanding phase of verification. Now here is where the story takes its most interesting turn. In March of 2026, DARPA did something unexpected. Instead of quietly continuing with the teams already inside the program, the agency reopened the initiative to brand new participants through what it called a new Stage A solicitation. In plain language, DARPA said, if you have a quantum computing approach we have not evaluated yet, now is your chance to enter the race. This is the reopening this video's title is talking about. And the timing tells you almost everything about how seriously the field is accelerating right now. Why would DARPA reopen its biggest quantum program instead of simply riding out the process with its existing 11 finalists? The agency's own leadership gave a remarkably honest answer. Micah Stoutemore, who took over as managing director of QBI during this transition, explained that both the program itself and the broader quantum computing field had advanced rapidly since the very first call for participants. In other words, the landscape shifted so much so fast that DARPA felt it had to open the door again just to make sure it was not missing a genuinely winning approach hiding somewhere outside its original applicant pool. And then came the sentence that should be the headline of every article written about this story. According to Stoutemore, it now seems likely that someone will actually build a utility-scale quantum computer by 2033. That is not a hedge. That is not typical government caution. That is DARPA essentially saying the fundamental question of whether useful quantum computing is achievable has shifted from probably not anytime soon to probably yes, and probably within less than a decade. But immediately after that confident statement came the honest, almost humbling admission driving this entire video. It remains completely unclear exactly which team or teams, will actually get across that finish line first. DARPA is not pretending to know the winner. It is not quietly betting everything on one favorite horse the way outsiders might assume a defense agency would. Instead, the agency explicitly stated it wants to keep evaluating every viable pathway, because right now, with the technology moving this fast, nobody, not even the people running the most sophisticated benchmarking program in the country, can confidently predict which architecture will ultimately win. Think about how rare that admission is. Governments, especially defense agencies, are usually allergic to public uncertainty. They prefer confident, controlled messaging. But here, DARPA chose transparency over false confidence, essentially telling the entire quantum computing industry, we do not know who wins this yet, so we are widening the net instead of narrowing it. That single decision reveals just how wide open and unpredictable the current state of quantum computing really is. Before we go further, if this kind of behind-the-scenes breakdown of what is actually happening in emerging technology is interesting to you, go ahead and tap that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel keep producing deep dives like this one. So who exactly are these 11 organizations competing inside Stage B, and why does their diversity matter so much? While DARPA has not published every technical detail publicly, we do know some of the players involved, and their approaches could not be more different from one another. Quantinuum, one of the leading trapped ion quantum computing companies, was selected to advance into Stage B, continuing its work on high-fidelity, topologically inspired quantum architectures. Quantinuum has separately been building major industrial partnerships throughout 2026, including collaborations with Rolls-Royce and the UK's National Supercomputing Centre, aimed at applying quantum computing to real engineering problems like gas turbine design. That detail matters because it shows Quantinuum is not just chasing government funding in isolation. It is simultaneously proving out commercial relevance in the private sector, which strengthens its overall credibility as a genuine contender in DARPA's benchmarking process. Other Stage B participants are believed to include teams working on superconducting qubit architectures, similar in spirit to the approach used by Google's Willow processor, as well as teams exploring neutral atom-based systems and other exotic approaches still considered underexplored compared to more mainstream quantum hardware designs. This diversity is exactly the point. Quantum computing is not a single technology with one obvious winning design, the way classical computing eventually converged around silicon-based transistors. Instead, there are multiple competing physical approaches to building a qubit, each with different strengths, different weaknesses, and different engineering challenges standing between today's noisy prototypes and tomorrow's utility-scale machines. Superconducting qubits are fast, but require extreme cooling. Trapped ion systems tend to offer excellent precision, but face scaling challenges. Neutral atom systems promise flexibility, but still need significant engineering maturity. Topological approaches theoretically offer built-in error resistance, but remain some of the most difficult systems to physically construct. DARPA's entire benchmarking strategy is built around this uncertainty. Rather than betting the country's quantum future on a single architecture, the agency created a structured, evidence-based process designed to let the strongest approaches reveal themselves over time through rigorous verification, not marketing hype or investor enthusiasm. That is precisely why the QBI program describes itself explicitly as not a competition between performers in the traditional sense. DARPA has stated clearly that it is interested in evaluating every viable approach for which funding is available, rather than picking favorites early and hoping they pan out. This measured, almost scientific patience stands in sharp contrast to how the private sector often behaves. Venture capital-driven quantum startups frequently need to generate excitement and press coverage to secure their next funding round, which creates strong incentives to overstate progress or rush premature milestone announcements. DARPA, funded by taxpayer money and driven by long-term national security priorities rather than quarterly investor updates, can afford to take a slower, more skeptical approach, demanding real evidence before declaring any kind of victory. Beyond QBI itself, DARPA has been running complementary programs that reveal just how seriously the agency is thinking about the messy, fragmented reality of quantum hardware. One notable example is a program exploring heterogeneous quantum architectures, essentially investigating whether future quantum computers might combine different types of qubits together within a single system, rather than betting everything on one uniform hardware approach. The logic here is fascinating. Just as classical computers combine specialized processors, like GPUs for graphics and CPUs for general computation, into unified systems, future quantum computers might combine different qubit types, each handling the specific computational tasks they are naturally best suited for. This heterogeneous approach could ultimately prove more practical than forcing a single architecture to handle every possible use case. IT also reflects a broader lesson DARPA appears to be applying across its quantum portfolio. Rather than assuming the winning quantum computer will look like a scaled-up version of whatever prototype currently gets the most headlines, the agency is deliberately funding research into unconventional combinations that might solve engineering problems more elegantly than any single existing approach. If you are new to this channel, now is a great time to hit subscribe, because we break down exactly these kinds of overlooked defense and technology stories that rarely get the mainstream attention they deserve. Let's talk about why any of this actually matters beyond scientific curiosity. Because DARPA does not spend serious money and reputation on research programs without extremely practical motivations behind them. Utility-scale quantum computing carries enormous national security implications, and the most obvious one involves cryptography. Modern encryption, protecting everything from military communications to financial systems to ordinary emails, relies on mathematical problems that are extremely difficult for classical computers to solve quickly. A sufficiently powerful quantum computer could potentially break some of that encryption, turning today's protected secrets into tomorrow's exposed vulnerabilities. This creates a strategic race with enormous stakes. Whoever builds a genuinely useful quantum computer first does not just gain scientific bragging rights. They potentially gain the ability to decrypt intercepted communications that adversaries assumed were permanently secure. This is exactly why cryptographers have long warned about harvest now, decrypt later strategies, where sensitive encrypted data gets collected today with the expectation that future quantum computers will eventually be able to crack it open. If DARPA genuinely believes utility-scale quantum computing could arrive by 2033, that timeline directly shapes how urgently the United States needs to transition its most sensitive systems toward post-quantum cryptography standards. But cryptography is only one piece of the national security puzzle here. Quantum computing also promises major advantages in optimization problems relevant to logistics, materials science, and even certain types of simulation used in designing advanced military hardware. A nation that gains a meaningful lead in practical quantum computing could accelerate breakthroughs in areas ranging from new materials for aircraft and submarines to more efficient supply chain and resource allocation systems during wartime scenarios. These are not abstract academic benefits. They translate directly into real strategic advantages on the global stage. This is also why DARPA's honest admission of uncertainty carries such weight internationally. Other nations, including major geopolitical rivals, are pouring enormous resources into their own quantum computing research programs. If the United States does not clearly know which technical approach will ultimately succeed, it becomes even more critical to fund a wide, diverse portfolio of research rather than narrowing focus too early and potentially backing the wrong horse while competitors surge ahead using a completely different, more successful architecture. There is also a fascinating financial dimension driving all of this urgency. Building even a single stage of experimental quantum hardware costs enormous amounts of money, often running into tens or hundreds of millions of dollars for the most ambitious approaches. Private companies pursuing quantum computing frequently rely on a mix of venture capital, corporate partnerships, and government contracts to fund their research, because the timelines involved are simply too long and too uncertain for many traditional investors to stomach entirely on their own. DARPA funding, through programs like QBI, essentially serves as a crucial bridge, allowing promising but commercially unproven approaches to survive long enough to prove themselves through rigorous testing. This dynamic also explains why so many quantum computing companies actively seek DARPA validation, even beyond the direct funding involved. Advancing through QBI's stages functions almost like an extremely rigorous scientific seal of approval. When a company like Quantinuum announces it has advanced to Stage B, that milestone signals credibility to investors, potential commercial partners, and the broader scientific community, well beyond whatever direct funding accompanies the achievement itself. In an industry full of bold claims and speculative promises, DARPA's brutal evidence-based evaluation process has become one of the most trusted credibility filters available. Let's also address the obvious question hanging over this entire story. If quantum computing has been perpetually 5 years away for the past 2 decades, why should anyone take this new wave of urgency seriously instead of dismissing it as more of the same recycled hype? The honest answer is that recent hardware results genuinely look different from earlier milestones. Error correction techniques have started demonstrating the mathematical scaling behavior researchers always hoped for but had never actually confirmed at meaningful scale. Multiple independent teams, using completely different physical approaches, have shown real progress on the specific engineering bottlenecks that previously made larger-scale quantum computing seem hopelessly far away. DARPA's own confidence, expressed through its leadership's public statements, reflects this shift. Government agencies generally avoid making bold predictions unless the underlying evidence genuinely supports doing so, especially when those predictions could later prove embarrassingly wrong in front of Congress and the public. The fact that DARPA is willing to say someone will likely build a utility-scale quantum computer by 2033, even while admitting uncertainty about exactly who, suggests the underlying scientific evidence has crossed some meaningful threshold of credibility within the past couple of years. Of course, meaningful uncertainty still remains, and it would be irresponsible to pretend otherwise. Building a full-scale, genuinely useful quantum computer within less than a decade remains an extraordinarily difficult engineering challenge, even with rapidly improving underlying science. Many previous technology predictions with similarly confident timelines have ultimately slipped by years, sometimes decades, once teams encountered unexpected engineering obstacles during the difficult transition from laboratory prototype to reliable, scalable system. DARPA's own structured multi-stage verification process exists precisely because the agency understands this risk, refusing to declare victory prematurely based on promising early results alone. What makes this story genuinely compelling, rather than just another speculative technology headline, is the sheer scale of DARPA's institutional humility here. This is an agency with a legendary track record of funding technologies that fundamentally reshaped the modern world, and it is choosing to widen its search rather than narrow it, precisely because the competitive landscape remains this unpredictable. That decision alone tells you the quantum computing race has entered a genuinely different, more serious phase compared to where it stood just a few years ago. It helps to step back for a moment and understand how QBI actually fits into DARPA's broader quantum portfolio, because this program did not appear out of nowhere. QBI is technically an expansion of an earlier initiative called the Underexplored Systems for Utility-Scale Quantum Computing Program, often referred to inside the agency simply as US2QC. That earlier pilot program specifically focused on quantum computing approaches that had received relatively little attention or funding compared to the more famous superconducting and trapped ion architectures dominating public headlines. Two performers from that original pilot program had already advanced all the way to Stage C, the most demanding verification phase, before QBI even fully absorbed the broader effort. That lineage matters because it reveals something important about DARPA's philosophy. The agency has never been interested purely in funding whichever approach already has the most momentum or public attention. Some of its earliest quantum investments deliberately targeted the underdogs, the strange, overlooked physical systems that mainstream investors and even some academic researchers had written off as impractical. The fact that some of those underexplored approaches are now among the furthest along in DARPA's own verification pipeline should humble anyone who assumes they already know which quantum architecture will eventually win. DARPA also runs a separate but related effort, simply called quantum benchmarking. Distinct from the Quantum Benchmarking Initiative despite the similar name, this earlier program focused on a slightly different but equally important question, essentially trying to determine the actual yardstick for measuring quantum computing impact in the first place. Before you can rigorously evaluate whether a quantum computer is useful, you need a scientifically credible way to define and measure usefulness itself, separate from marketing claims or theoretical potential. That foundational benchmarking work laid essential groundwork for the more ambitious verification process QBI later built on top of it. This layered, methodical approach stands in sharp contrast to how quantum computing progress often gets reported in the media. A single company announces a new qubit record, and headlines immediately declare a breakthrough, sometimes without acknowledging that raw qubit count means very little without corresponding improvements in error rates, coherence times, and gate fidelity. DARPA's multi-program structure essentially exists to cut through exactly that kind of hype, insisting on rigorous or reproducible evidence before any claim gets treated as a genuine milestone worth acting on. Let's also talk about the human side of this story, because leadership transitions inside government research programs rarely make headlines, yet they often reveal a lot about institutional priorities. The original founding program manager of QBI, Joe Altepeter, is departing the agency, with Micah Stoutimore stepping into the role of managing director during this exact moment of expansion. Stoutimore previously served as deputy program manager for QBI, meaning he helped shape the program's evaluation framework from very early on, giving him deep institutional knowledge of exactly how rigorous and demanding the verification process has been designed to be. Before joining DARPA, Stoutimore worked as a scientist specializing in superconducting technologies at Northrop Grumman, one of the largest defense contractors in the country. That background matters because it means the person now steering one of the most important quantum computing evaluation programs in the world brings direct hands-on experience with one of the leading physical approaches to building qubits, rather than a purely administrative or policy-focused background. His technical fluency likely played a role in DARPA's confidence when making its bold public statement about the eventual arrival of utility-scale quantum computing by 2033. Leadership transitions like this one also tend to introduce fresh strategic thinking, even within programs that already have strong existing momentum. A new managing director, stepping in right as the program reopens for new applicants, suggests DARPA saw this moment as a natural inflection point, a chance to simultaneously refresh leadership and widen the competitive field at the same time, rather than simply continuing forward on autopilot with the same 11 Stage B participants indefinitely. Now let's dig deeper into why the timing of this reopening lines up so closely with broader momentum across the entire quantum computing industry throughout 2026. This was not an isolated DARPA decision made in a vacuum. Throughout the first half of the year, multiple independent research teams around the world reported meaningful progress on the core engineering bottlenecks that have historically limited quantum computing's practical usefulness. Something researchers had modeled theoretically for years, but rarely confirmed convincingly at meaningful hardware scale. Separately, academic and industry partnerships began demonstrating entirely new physical approaches to achieving fault tolerance, including methods that reduce reliance on extremely resource-intensive error correction techniques that had previously made scaling seem prohibitively expensive. When DARPA's leadership describes the broader quantum computing field as having advanced rapidly, they are almost certainly referring to this exact wave of independent, peer-reviewed progress happening simultaneously across multiple unrelated research groups, rather than any single company's isolated announcement. This kind of simultaneous, distributed progress across multiple unrelated teams is often a much stronger signal than any single flashy breakthrough from one company alone. When only one organization claims a major milestone, healthy scientific skepticism demands careful scrutiny, since marketing incentives can sometimes color how results get presented publicly. But when multiple independent teams using different physical approaches and different underlying assumptions all report meaningful progress on similar fundamental problems around the same general time frame, that convergence carries far more scientific weight. It suggests the underlying physics itself is genuinely cooperating, rather than any single team simply overselling incremental progress. This broader context helps explain why DARPA felt confident enough to make its unusually bold public prediction, while simultaneously admitting deep uncertainty about which specific team will ultimately succeed. The agency is not reacting to isolated hype from one company's press release. It is responding to a genuine industry-wide shift in the underlying trajectory of the science itself, which naturally makes broad confidence about eventual success easier to state publicly, even while the specific competitive outcome remains genuinely unpredictable. It is also worth examining how this story connects to the private sector's own accelerating quantum ambitions, because DARPA does not operate in isolation from the broader commercial quantum ecosystem. Companies like Quantinuum have been simultaneously pursuing government validation through programs like QBI, while also aggressively building commercial partnerships designed to prove real-world relevance outside of pure government funding. Its collaboration with Rolls-Royce and the UK's National Supercomputing Centre focuses specifically on applying quantum computing to genuinely difficult engineering problems, like the complex fluid dynamics simulations required for advanced gas turbine design. Separately, Quantinuum announced a strategic collaboration with Hewlett-Packard Enterprise focused specifically on integrating quantum computing directly with high-performance computing and artificial intelligence infrastructure. This partnership reflects a broader industry-wide belief that the future of quantum computing will not involve quantum processors operating in isolation, but rather quantum systems working seamlessly alongside classical supercomputers and AI infrastructure to unlock practical scientific and industrial value that neither technology could achieve entirely on its own. This hybrid vision matters enormously for understanding DARPA's own strategic thinking as well. When the agency talks about utility-scale quantum computing, it is not necessarily imagining a standalone quantum computer replacing classical systems entirely. It is far more likely imagining quantum processors integrated into larger computational workflows, handling very specific bottleneck calculations that classical systems genuinely struggle with, while classical infrastructure continues managing everything else around them. That nuance is easy to miss in casual conversation about quantum computing, but it fundamentally shapes how practical, near-term utility-scale quantum computing might actually look once it finally arrives. Before wrapping up, it is worth pausing on just how unusual it is for taxpayer-funded research to be discussed this openly and in this much technical detail through public channels. DARPA has historically operated with a certain mystique, funding secretive, compartmentalized research that only becomes publicly known years or even decades after the fact. The relatively transparent, detailed public communication style surrounding QBI, including named program managers, specific numbers of Stage B participants, and even direct quotes about uncertainty regarding eventual winners, represents a noticeably different communication approach for an agency historically associated with classified secrecy. That transparency likely serves a strategic purpose beyond simple public relations. By openly communicating both its confidence and its uncertainty, DARPA may be deliberately encouraging additional promising research teams, including smaller startups and academic groups that might otherwise assume government quantum funding is already locked up among a handful of major players, to submit their own proposals during this newly reopened Stage A window. Genuine transparency about ongoing uncertainty functions almost like a public invitation, signaling that the competition genuinely remains wide open for anyone with a credible, well-evidenced approach. Pay close attention to which additional organizations get selected under this newly reopened Stage A solicitation, since abstracts were due by the end of July 2026 and full proposals soon after. Watch for any teams currently in Stage B advancing further into the demanding verification process of Stage C, and pay particularly close attention to whether completely new, previously underexplored architectural approaches manage to break into the competition, since DARPA has explicitly stated its interest in evaluating entrants using distinct methods not yet assessed under the existing program. There is one more angle worth exploring before we reach the conclusion, and it involves how ordinary Americans and businesses might eventually feel the ripple effects of this program, even though QBI itself operates almost entirely behind the scenes of everyday life. Defense research programs like this one have a long track record of eventually spilling over into civilian technology in ways nobody originally anticipated. GPS started as a military navigation project decades before it ended up guiding everyone's daily commute. The foundational technology behind the modern internet emerged from defense research long before anyone imagined social media, streaming video, or online banking. If DARPA's confidence about utility-scale quantum computing by 2033 proves accurate, the ripple effects could eventually touch industries far removed from national security. Pharmaceutical companies could gain dramatically faster tools for simulating molecular interactions during drug discovery. Materials science researchers could accelerate the search for better batteries, more efficient solar cells, and stronger, lighter alloys for everything from aircraft to electric vehicles. Financial institutions could eventually use quantum optimization techniques to manage extraordinarily complex risk calculations far more efficiently than classical systems currently allow. None of that civilian spillover is guaranteed, and much of it likely remains years or even decades further out than the raw hardware timeline DARPA is discussing. But history strongly suggests that once a foundational computing breakthrough reaches genuine utility scale reliability, commercial applications tend to follow far more quickly than most people originally expect, often arriving in forms nobody predicted at the outset. The transistor, the microprocessor, and the internet itself all followed remarkably similar patterns, starting as narrow, specialized research efforts before eventually reshaping entire industries in ways their original creators never fully anticipated. This is precisely why stories like DARPA's quantum reopening deserve far more mainstream attention than they typically receive. It is easy to dismiss government research announcements as dry, bureaucratic, or irrelevant to everyday life, especially when the language involves phrases like Stage A solicitations and other transaction agreements. But underneath that bureaucratic language sits one of the most consequential technology races currently underway anywhere in the world, one that could eventually reshape cryptography, scientific research, and computational capability across nearly every major industry on the planet. It is also worth remembering that DARPA's own history includes plenty of research programs that ultimately did not pan out as originally hoped, alongside its more famous successes. Not every ambitious DARPA bet transforms into GPS or the internet. Some quietly fade away after years of investment once fundamental technical barriers prove genuinely insurmountable within realistic timeframes. That honest track record of both triumphs and quiet failures is actually part of why the agency's current confidence about quantum computing carries real weight. DARPA has enough institutional experience distinguishing genuinely promising research from research that merely sounds promising, and its willingness to make a bold public prediction here should not be dismissed lightly. At the same time, the agency's explicit admission of uncertainty about which specific team will win reflects a mature, evidence-driven mindset that resists the temptation to declare premature victory simply because momentum feels strong in the moment. That balance between confidence in the destination and humility about the exact path there is exactly what makes this particular story worth paying close attention to over the next several years, far more than most individual quantum computing headlines that come and go without lasting significance. It represents a moment where one of the most sophisticated technology evaluation agencies on the planet looked at the entire landscape of quantum computing research and concluded, with real confidence, that someone is probably going to solve this within less than a decade, while simultaneously admitting it genuinely does not know who that will be. That combination of confidence and humility is rare, and it is exactly why this reopening deserves far more attention than it has received so far. If this breakdown helped you understand what is really happening behind DARPA's quantum computing strategy, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe to this channel, because these are exactly the kinds of quietly massive stories that shape the next decade of technology and national security, long before mainstream headlines ever catch up. Drop a comment letting me know which quantum architecture you think has the best shot at winning this race, and I will see you in the next video.